Hey everyone, my name is Jazz Brooks, and today I'll be talking about how to create temperature sensations using a special nerve in our body called the trigeminal nerve. This work was done in collaboration with my colleague Stephen Nagels and my advisor Pedro Lopes. We'd also like to thank the CHI community for a Best Paper Award. We appreciate the gesture enormously. So, I'll be talking about how this user is actually able to feel the temperature of the virtual scene using a low-powered device that we created specifically for that effect. This work is largely motivated by how virtual reality has become increasingly realistic. Here I whipped up two different scenes, and they're both fairly photorealistic already. Alongside this kind of visual realism, industry and researchers have been exploring other modes of realism, like touch, force feedback, odors, or even rendering the temperature of virtual scenes. Now, I'll be going over how researchers in industry have been doing this kind of like thermal feedback for these devices. The most evident way to do this is via heat lamps or air conditioning units, which essentially change the temperature of a large volume of air, and VR arcade setups like the VR Sense, in fact, use this kind of technique. Unfortunately, they require a lot of energy. So it kind of runs contrary to what virtual reality is moving towards, which is mostly untethered devices. In fact, VR's biggest impact and promise are in like home setups or fully portable setups, like the Oculus Quest on the left, the Oculus Go on the left, and the Oculus Quest on the right. Nowadays, researchers have actually been miniaturizing this kind of thermal feedback and even putting some devices inside of the headset to create those sensations. Oftentimes, they use something called thermoelectric materials, or Peltier-elements. Now, what's nice about these is that they can be really small. And the way they function is when you put a current through it, it creates a temperature difference across the surface. One side gets hot and the other side gets cold. Unfortunately, to sustain that temperature difference, you need an equivalent amount of power. So they can get small, but they usually remain tethered. So let's take thermo VR, for example. If you wanted to create a 10-minute like full cold scene for the VR environment, you would have to take 10 of the Peltiers on the device, each put them at -3 degrees Celsius, and then sustain that for 10 minutes. Each one would take about 0.5 amp hours, which means the whole thing is going to take approximately 5 amp hours. And that's already 1.5 times your phone's battery life. So you're starting to get like the problem that's happening right now. And our goal is basically, can we actually create these sensations without using lots of power? Which probably means that we can't use a technique that's bounded by physics. In fact, our approach is relying on thermal illusion, in which we chemically actuate our senses. For this, we focus on the chemical senses that we have, in particular the ones in our nose. Now, most people are probably familiar with the tongue for tasting, or the olfactory bulb for smelling things. But there's a third nerve in our head called the trigeminal nerve. And most people aren't familiar with this, but they actually experience it at the same time as tasting and smelling things. So if you've ever had something spicy or bubbly or refreshing, those kinds of sensations are actually the trigeminal nerve responding. Now, this nerve responds to mechanical deformation, so like tactile stimuli, as well as having receptors to respond to temperature stimuli. So if you go outside at -10 degrees Celsius in like the Chicago winter, and you breathe in the cold, crisp air that you're feeling, in fact, that's the trigeminal nerve responding. And what's pretty neat about this is that these receptors not only respond to temperature, but also to chemical stimuli, which makes me wonder, can we actually create all these sensations only with chemical stimuli? So here we're focusing on two particular receptors, one that's called TRPV1, that's temperature gated, aka it starts like firing off and responding to things once the temperature in the tissue is around 45 degrees Celsius and above, which is very hot for the body. And then the TRPM8, which is a cold receptor that responds to temperatures in the body that's like 25 degrees Celsius and below. Now, these two receptors also respond to things found commonly in plants, like capsaicin in chilies or mint and menthol. And we were interested in seeing if we could use kind of like already available essential oils, as well as easily accessible chemical compounds to create these kinds of temperature sensations in virtual reality. So the first thing we did was implement a prototypical thermal display, which in our case is in fact an olfactory display. Here, we're using a phone to wirelessly communicate with it and actuate it. And the device includes a Bluetooth microcontroller for wireless communication, micropumps to pump around all the liquids, 1 milliliter reservoirs for each compound, and then a vibrating mesh atomizer to create an aerosol. This lets us do things like emit capsaicin to create a warming sensation. And all we have to do for that is pump some of the liquids from one reservoir out to the mesh, as well as do things like using eucalyptal to create a cooling sensation, or even output mixtures, something like capsaicin with a smell. So we could do like temperature plus odors. Now, two problems we had to take into consideration were the following. The first one was that capsaicin doesn't evaporate at the same temperature as alcohol. In fact, it kind of sediments and crystallizes. So we couldn't do evaporation, which is a pretty common feature in olfactory displays. Instead, we had to keep everything in liquid phase, aka we had to create an aerosol of tiny droplets. To do this, we ended up using a vibrating mesh transducer, which creates the aerosolization. Second, because we're only using one atomizer, we run the risk of creating cross-contamination between the channels. You wouldn't want eucalyptal and capsaicin to run at the same time unless you specifically wanted that for some reason. To avoid this, what we did was have each channel have its own reservoir, set of pumps. Each channel has its own reservoir, tubing, and set of pumps. On top of that, we added capillary tubes at the end of the tubing at the contact point for the atomizer. What this allows is when the micropump creates droplets, the atomizer quickly gets the droplet and then atomizes it. So there's not going to be any lingering liquids. But the capillary tubes serve a secondary purpose where, because they constrict the flow so much, there's no backflow. So if you create a droplet, it's not going to flow back into another channel's tube. Finally, we also made it so that these reservoirs are pretty easily accessible. So you can take one out, refill it, or even swap it with another compound. The device is pretty interesting on its own in that when you render temperatures, it only costs about 0.25 watts. That's a stark contrast to Peltier-elements, which may take 50 watts or more. So in our research studies, the first thing we were asking ourselves was which stimulants were best to create these hot and cold sensations. We ended up looking through medical and olfactory literature to find first 3 warm candidates, including thymol, a cayenne pepper tincture, which is in our case capsaicin, and I'll be referring to it that way from now on, and then methyl salicylate. Additionally, we chose 3 cool candidates, linalool, eucalyptal, and peppermint essential oil, of which the last one has a lot of menthol in it. We have to also note that methyl salicylate and linalool actually activate a mixture of warm and cool TRP channels. For a baseline in this kind of study, what we ended up using was the solvents, what we used to dilute all these kinds of compounds. In this case, ethanol, aka Everclear, for us. So participants inhaled 1 microliter of these compounds and then had to rate their perceived temperature sensation. First, we found that linalool and methyl salicylate both elicited a large range of different temperature sensations, and that lines up pretty well with the fact that they both actuate cool and warm TRP channels. We then found that peppermint essential oil and thymol are actually the strongest perceived temperature sensations. Unfortunately, they're both not only smellable, so if it's in the air, you know there's something that you're smelling, but readily recognizable. So if you smell peppermint essential oil, you'll probably recognize that it's minty or that it's probably just peppermint essential oil. Peppermint. Unfortunately, what we're looking for in this case is are compounds that not only elicit the temperature sensations, but also are not very recognizable, so they don't break the temperature illusion. Luckily, eucalyptal and capsaicin fit this criteria very well. Despite being smellable, eucalyptal was not readily recognizable by most people in the study. Additionally, capsaicin is odorless on its own. Finally, people were able to distinguish these kinds of temperature sensations with only 1 microliter of volume. That's incredibly small, meaning that we can use very small quantities of eucalyptal and capsaicin to create the kind of temperature illusions that we wanted. We then tested these temperature illusions in VR. Participants were placed in a VR scene, either a hot desert or a cold mountain, and then either represented a baseline, aka the solvent again, or the temperature congruent trigeminal stimulus. So in the case of the cold mountain, it would either be ethanol for the baseline or menthol for its trigeminal stimulant. What we found is that the temperature illusion held up. So in the cold mountain case, it was actually much colder with menthol included. And then in the hot desert section, when you included capsaicin, you actually created largely warm sensations. So this ended up confirming that these trigeminal stimulants with visually congruent environments actually creates the thermal illusion still. So we ended up taking these results alongside our prototype and created a full experience for them. So here, a user is warming up at the furnace inside of a random cabin in the woods. And we render the warmth of the furnace via capsaicin, which activates the TRPV1 channel in the trigeminal nerve, creating an odorless warming sensation. Then, because of a storm, a power outage comes out, which cuts off all the electricity and the heat. Now, because of the cold winds coming in, we end up emitting eucalyptal to create a cooling sensation via the TRPM8 channel of the trigeminal nerve. Because it's cold, the user goes outside to try and find the emergency electric generator. And because it's colder outside, we actually emit eucalyptal more frequently. They then find the emergency generator, switch it on, which then provides a bit of heat, so we add in some capsaicin, and go a step further and throw in our rubbery odor to create kind of like the sensation of burning fuel. And our device here is doing not only temperature, but also mixing in odors. So now that the power is back on, they're going to go back inside and stay warm. And on their way in, they turn around and close the door. At this point, we stop the eucalyptal, since there's not much cold air coming in anymore, and instead start emitting capsaicin again. At which point they can go warm up at the furnace again. Now, to conclude, we introduced a new way of creating temperature sensations in virtual reality, in fact using an illusion that's about 52 times more efficient than Peltier-elements. However, it is still an illusion still. So right now, the range of sensations is quite limited, but this opens up a new venue of researching synthetic compounds for these temperature receptors. For example, isolin, that's a synthetic compound for the TRPM8 cold receptor, is about 50 times colder than menthol and also has no odor. Another consideration is just that these kinds of sensations are tied directly with the user's breathing, and users sometimes might unconsciously alter their breathing to avoid exposure to certain compounds. At the moment, the sensation is pretty much limited and localized to the face, but several participants actually expressed that it spread to the chest. Finally, this does allow a very neat and simple upgrade for olfactory displays to render not only odors but also temperatures, and this extends beyond VR context to mobile and augmented reality ones as well. Now, while this illusion has a lot of promise, we're excited to explore it at other locations to create richer thermal experiences. So I'd like to thank my collaborators again. First, my colleague Steven Nagels, and then my advisor Pedro Lopes. Thank you for your attention, and I'll answer your questions now.